It started as the quietest Halloween I'd ever spent, which I took as a good thing. I was alone in my new place, a tiny, old apartment on the outskirts of town that sat on the edge of a wooded lot. I figured the wooded road and overgrown yard were deterrents enough. The silence was strange, though. No passing cars, no distant chatter, just an eerie stillness that filled the room, like a presence that was waiting for something. Around midnight, I decided to try and sleep. I was tired, but the kind of tired where your body feels heavy but your mind refuses to rest. I turned off the lights and crawled into bed, trying to ignore the feeling that had been tugging at me since I moved in. The feeling that I was being watched. Brushed it off as nerves or the natural anxiety of adjusting to a new place. But tonight, lying in that thick, oppressive silence, something was different. The walls seemed to press inward, and the shadows pooled in the corners, as if they'd become more solid. My mind started playing tricks, filling the darkness with shapes and faint sounds. I closed my eyes, clinging to the idea of sleep as my only escape. Then, just as I felt myself slipping into unconsciousness, I heard something. A faint sound, like a whisper, coming from the other side of the bedroom. It was so soft I could have imagined it, but it grew steadily, becoming a garbled, incoherent murmur. I stayed perfectly still, my heart hammering in my chest, listening. It was as if someone was there, standing just out of reach, muttering in a low, wet voice that filled the air with a chill. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or the old pipes. I repeated it over and over in my head like a mantra, hoping it would calm me down. But the whispering didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder, filling the entire room until it seemed to come from the walls themselves. I felt a cold dread spreading through me, every nerve in my body screaming for me to open my eyes, to face whatever was there. Yet I couldn't. My body wouldn't move. Then, out of nowhere, it stopped. The silence that followed was even worse, somehow. It wasn't just quiet. It was suffocating, like all the sound had been drained from the air. I lay there, frozen, my skin prickling with a feeling I can only describe as wrongness. That's when I felt it. A pressure at the foot of my bed, like the mattress sinking under the weight of something heavy. I forced my eyes open, peering into the darkness. First, I saw nothing, just the outlines of furniture. But then, slowly, something began to take shape. A figure, hunched and shadowed, crouched at the end of the bed. Its face was obscured, but I could see its eyes, two pinpricks of gleaming light staring right at me, unblinking. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, choking me. The figure moved closer, its eyes never leaving mine. As it drew nearer, I felt a wave of cold wash over me, sinking into my bones, as if it was draining the warmth from my body. It leaned in, so close I could feel its breath, a damp, rotten warmth that made my stomach turn. And then, it whispered, in a voice so low it barely sounded human, "Don't look away. I don't remember falling asleep. I don't remember much of anything after that moment. Just an overwhelming darkness and the sensation of falling, like I was sinking into the bed, into something deeper than sleep, something that held me in its grip and wouldn't let go." When I woke up, the room was empty, silent, and painfully bright with daylight. I felt strange, like I hadn't truly slept. I was exhausted, my limbs heavy and unresponsive. It felt like something had been taken from me, leaving me hollow, just a shell going through the motions. Every night since, that feeling has returned. As soon as I close my eyes, I feel it waiting, a presence that presses against the edge of sleep, just out of sight, whispering. I can still hear it, that voice, repeating the same words over and over again. "Don't look away." That night, after hearing the whispers and seeing those eyes, everything changed. Each evening, the feeling of dread crept in earlier, thickening the air in my apartment with a cold, almost metallic scent. I tried to ignore it, to shake off the fatigue that seemed to cling to me like a second skin, but every night was the same. As soon as the sun dipped below the trees, I'd feel that suffocating stillness seep into the room, filling the empty spaces with an almost imperceptible hum. I thought I could handle it, that maybe it was all in my head, a kind of Halloween hangover, maybe a bad dream I hadn't fully woken up from. But the nights became something else entirely. They grew longer, or at least they felt that way, stretching into something I can only describe as wrong. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear it, the whisper. Only now it didn't stop at one word. The whispering had grown more urgent, louder, no longer content to be a distant murmur. I'd lay in bed, desperately clutching my blankets, and I could feel the words slithering into my mind, planting themselves there like roots. They'd begin softly, a gentle hiss at first. Then they'd pick up faster, like 100 voices talking over each other, layering and overlapping until they became a single, incomprehensible growl. And every time, just as the growl hit a fever pitch, I'd hear that one unmistakable phrase, "Don't look away." One night, when the whispering was so loud I thought I'd lose my mind, I finally caved. I'd had enough. I turned on every light in the apartment and sat up in bed, trying to convince myself that I was stronger than this, whatever this was. That's when I noticed something odd about the wall in front of me. In the low, golden glow of my bedside lamp, the paint seemed to shimmer, just slightly, as though it was moving. I squinted, leaning closer, trying to convince myself it was just the play of light, but the shimmer grew stronger, more defined. It was then that I realized there were shapes moving within the wall. Faces, dozens of them, distorted and grimacing, mouths stretched in silent screams, eyes wide with a haunting, empty stare. They were pressed against the wall, as though trapped behind a thin layer, shifting and writhing as if desperate to break through. My stomach twisted, but I couldn't look away. I was mesmerized, rooted in place by sheer horror. One of the faces was more defined than the others, pressing forward with such intensity that I could see the lines in its hollow cheeks, the pale, cracked lips, and those familiar, gleaming eyes. The same eyes I'd seen at the foot of my bed. And then, like something snapping, the face lurched forward, pressing against the wall so hard that I thought it would rip through. The whispering returned, pouring into the room from every direction, louder than ever, echoing off the walls and filling my mind. The voices were inside me now, circling like vultures, gnawing at my thoughts, tearing at my sanity. They spoke in tongues I couldn't understand, an ancient guttural language that felt wrong, like it was never meant for human ears. And then, from the cacophony, one voice emerged, clearer than the others. I recognized it immediately as the same voice that had haunted my nights, only now it was deeper, closer, like it was whispering directly into my ear. "Look behind you." I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still, to keep my eyes fixed on the wall. But my head was moving on its own, slowly, painfully, like some force was guiding me. I felt the air grow colder as I turned, inch by inch, my heart hammering against my ribs. And there, standing in the doorway, was the figure. But it wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that stretched too long and bent in ways that no humans should. Its skin was gray, almost translucent, and its eyes were bottomless pits of black, pulling me in like a void. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there watching me. I tried to scream, to run, to do anything, but my body wouldn't obey. It felt like I was sinking, like some invisible weight was pulling me down, anchoring me to the bed. The figure took a step closer, its bones cracking and popping with every movement, and that's when I saw its mouth. A thin, lipless line that stretched across its face, splitting open to reveal rows of teeth. Too many teeth, sharp and glistening. The whispers grew louder, drowning out my thoughts until all I could hear was that single horrific voice drilling into my mind. "You belong to us now." The lights in the room flickered, dimming until they went out completely, plunging me into darkness. And in that darkness, I felt it. A cold hand, thin and bony, pressing down on my shoulder. I felt myself sinking again, deeper and deeper, like I was being pulled out of my own skin, my consciousness slipping away as the darkness closed in around me. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the sound of whispering. 100 voices all speaking in unison, filling my mind with a single, inescapable truth. The last Halloween I remember clearly happened the night I came back to my childhood home. A creaking Victorian place perched on the edge of a small lake. The night was cold, the air heavy with that damp, autumn smell of decaying leaves. I had been away for years and had barely given the house a thought, but something that year, a tug in my mind, a quiet, relentless urge, had drawn me back. From the start, the house felt off. The air inside was stale, as if it had been holding its breath, waiting for me. The rooms were dim, shadows clinging to the walls even when I flicked on the lights. And there was a strange silence that seemed to grow thicker with every hour, seeping into my skin. I convinced myself it was the memories of childhood loneliness, that the house was just dredging up old fears, making me feel like I was 8 years old again, hiding under the covers. I remember thinking, it's nothing, just an empty house. The hours slipped by slowly, and by midnight, I was exhausted. I was ready to pass out, but then I heard it. Faint, so faint it was almost inaudible. A soft knock coming from somewhere deep in the house. I told myself it was probably the old plumbing or wood settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened closely. Another knock, this time closer, coming from downstairs. It was rhythmic, deliberate, almost polite, as if someone was tapping a fingernail against the walls as they made their way toward me. The thought that someone could be in the house sent a spike of cold panic through me. But before I could make sense of it, a new sound replaced the knock. A faint, hushed whisper that floated up the staircase, carrying a tone I hadn't heard since I was a kid. It was calling my name. I swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the bed, too afraid to breathe, to move. My heart raced in time with the knocks, which grew louder and more insistent. The whisper repeated my name over and over, each time becoming less like my own voice and more like something else. Something hollow and rasping, scraping along the edges of words it wasn't meant to speak. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, the silence returned. The house felt empty again, still. Get up, I told myself, check the house. But my body felt heavy, locked in place. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been calling me was still there, lurking just beyond my line of sight. And that's when I saw it. At the end of the hallway, just outside the door to my old bedroom, stood a figure. It was barely more than a shadow, tall and thin, its head tilted slightly, as if observing me with a terrible, inhuman patience. Its face was a pale, sickly blur, eyes darker than anything I'd ever seen, as if they absorbed the light rather than reflected it. Stayed still, watching, and I stayed still, trying not to breathe, hoping that if I didn't move, it wouldn't notice me. But then it began to move. Slowly, agonizingly slowly. It took a step forward, and I felt an icy chill wrap around my spine. With every step it took, my room grew colder, the air heavier, thick with a scent that made my stomach turn. A damp, decaying odor that seeped into the walls, into my skin. As it reached the door to my room, I felt my mind slipping. A strange, suffocating pressure wrapped around my thoughts, forcing memories up from the deepest parts of my mind. Memories I hadn't thought about in years. It was as if the figure was pulling them out, tearing into my mind, sifting through my past like pages in a book. I couldn't hold back the memories that surfaced. The nights I'd spent as a child, lying awake in that same room, certain that something was watching me from the dark corners. The whispers I'd heard back then, faint and constant, weaving through the walls, calling my name, and the fleeting glimpses of shadows that had stalked me for as long as I could remember, lurking just out of sight, waiting for a moment like this. A realization settled over me then, thick and horrifying. This thing, it wasn't new. It had been with me all along, following me, waiting for the right time. And now, somehow, I had given it an invitation back into my life. The air felt thick, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. I tried to scream, to reach out, to do anything, but I couldn't move. It was as if my body was no longer mine. The figure leaned in, its face mere inches from mine, and I could see its eyes now, two bottomless pits of darkness that pulled me in. A voice, cold and distant, echoed in my mind, speaking words that I couldn't understand but that resonated in my bones, like an ancient, terrible truth. And then, without warning, the thing whispered, in a voice so low I felt it rather than heard it, "I am yours and you are mine." The words burrowed into my mind, embedding themselves deep within me. I felt something cold and heavy settle in my chest, like a weight I would never be able to lift. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the figure was gone. The air was empty, and the room was silent. I don't remember much after that, but when I woke up, it was morning. The house was still, the sun casting an eerie light through the window. I sat up, feeling a strange emptiness inside me, as if a part of me had been taken, or perhaps, as if something else had been left behind. Now, every night I feel its presence. It's with me, lurking just beyond the edge of sleep, whispering in that cold, rasping voice, waiting. I see it in every shadow, feel it in every silence. Halloween was only the beginning, and somehow I know it'll be with me forever. Halloween had always been a big deal in our family. We were the kind of family that went all out, with decorations spilling out of every corner, bowls of candy on every surface, and costumes carefully chosen weeks in advance. That night, the air was thick with excitement. My mom had baked her famous pumpkin cookies, my dad had hung lights on the porch, and my little brother was already wearing his vampire cape, zooming around the house like a whirlwind. Even my sister, who usually rolled her eyes at Halloween, was laughing, caught up in the mood. We were all gathered around the dining table, talking and eating, the candlelight flickering warmly. The atmosphere was perfect, but then something shifted. It started with a sudden chill that crept in, so sharp and unexpected that we all stopped mid-laugh, glancing at each other. My dad frowned and stood up to check the thermostat, but before he could even reach the wall, something else happened. The napkins on the table lifted, fluttering as if a gust of wind had swept through the room. A faint rattling sound filled the air, and our drinks slid across the table, spilling in slow, quiet motions. I remember feeling my skin prickle as I watched, completely frozen, a single fork rolling off the table with a clatter that echoed in the silence. My mom gave a nervous laugh, trying to brush it off, but we all felt it. The tension, the strange, unnatural cold that seeped into our bones. Then, without warning, the front door creaked open on its own. My dad immediately went to close it, muttering about the wind, but there wasn't any wind that night. Outside was still and quiet, almost too quiet. He tried to close the door, but it wouldn't budge, like some invisible hand was holding it open. His face twisted with confusion, and he gave it a harder push, finally slamming it shut. But the moment he let go, it swung open again, creaking slowly, as if taunting us. By then, my little brother was clinging to my mom's side, his face pale, his vampire cape forgotten. I watched my parents exchange a worried glance, and I could tell they were trying to stay calm for us. My mom stood up, nervously tidying the table, trying to keep the evening from unraveling. She reached for the candlesticks to move them to a shelf, and that's when it happened. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging us into darkness. We sat there in the silence, our breaths echoing in the dark, too afraid to move. My dad was the first to reach for his phone, turning on the flashlight, casting long shadows on the walls. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, and I gripped the edge of the table, the wood rough under my fingers, grounding me in some small way. And then we heard it. A soft, distant whisper, barely audible but unmistakable, floating from somewhere deep in the house. My mom looked at my dad, her eyes wide, silently asking if he'd heard it too. He nodded, his face pale, and we all listened, straining to make out the words. It sounded like someone calling a name, but it was muffled, distorted, like a voice trapped underwater. Who is that?" My sister whispered, her voice trembling. None of us answered. My dad stood up, slowly making his way toward the hallway, his flashlight casting strange shadows on the walls. I watched as he disappeared around the corner, his light flickering as he moved deeper into the darkness. We sat there, waiting, listening, the silence thick and oppressive. Then, from the hallway, we heard my dad's footsteps stop. There was a pause, and then a sound I'll never forget. The scrape of something heavy being dragged along the floor, followed by a soft, low hum that grew louder, filling the house with a strange, pulsing rhythm. My dad returned, his face pale, his eyes wide and unfocused. He looked at us, his mouth opening as if he wanted to say something, but no sound came out. Instead, he just stood there, staring at us, as if he didn't recognize us. I wanted to ask him what he'd seen, but I was too scared to break the silence. And then, slowly, he lifted his hand and pointed toward the living room. We turned, following his gaze, and that's when we saw her. A figure, standing in the corner, barely visible in the dim light from my dad's phone. She was tall and thin, her face hidden in shadow, her long dark hair hanging in tangled strands. Her dress was old-fashioned, the kind you'd see in a century-old portrait, and it was soaked, dripping water onto the floor, pooling around her feet. My mom gasped, clutching my brother closer, and my sister's hand found mine, gripping so tightly it hurt. The woman's head tilted slightly, and I saw her eyes, hollow and dark, fixed on us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. My mom pulled my brother to his feet, and my dad, still dazed, took my sister's hand, leading us slowly, carefully toward the door. As we moved, the woman's gaze followed us, unblinking, her eyes like two black voids, filled with an ancient anger, an anger that seemed to seep into the walls, into the air, into us. We stumbled outside, gasping for breath, the cold night air sharp and real against our skin. We huddled together on the porch, shivering, too afraid to look back. My dad closed the door, and for a long time we just stood there in silence, listening to the empty night. Eventually, we drove to my aunt's house, none of us saying a word. We didn't talk about what we'd seen, what we'd felt, but that night stayed with us, haunting the edges of our thoughts, lurking in the dark corners of our minds. And now, every Halloween, we all feel it. The chill, the strange silence that seems to settle over us, as if she's still watching, waiting, her voice echoing in our minds with a warning that we'll never forget. Leave. started as a joke. Halloween, the one night a year you're supposed to scare yourself for fun. A group of us, 5 friends who'd known each other since grade school, had decided we'd do something different that year. Instead of the usual parties and haunted houses, we'd go to the old cemetery at the edge of town and tell ghost stories under the light of the full moon. The cemetery was ancient, a sprawling, forgotten patch of land that locals avoided, even in daylight. The tombstones were cracked and covered in moss, leaning at odd angles, some completely buried by roots. Rumors swirled about the place, that it was cursed, that people who entered after dark could still hear the voices of the dead. None of us really believed it, of course. We laughed at the thought, brushing off the warnings as superstition. We arrived around 11, each of us carrying a flashlight. The cemetery was cold and deathly quiet, the kind of silence that eats up all sound. Our voices seemed too loud, unnatural against the stillness. But we pushed the feeling down, choosing a spot by an old gnarled tree, its bare branches twisting against the night sky. We shared our stories, each tale darker and more horrifying than the last. But each time one of us finished, the silence returned, heavier, as if the cemetery itself were listening, absorbing our words. I could feel a chill in the air that went beyond the cold of the night. It crept up my spine, prickling my skin, as if unseen eyes were watching us from the shadows. I glanced around, scanning the rows of graves, but saw only darkness. "Let's go deeper," Tom suggested. He was always the boldest, never backing down from a dare. "See if we can find the oldest tombstone." The rest of us exchanged glances, half hoping someone would say no. But peer pressure did its job, and soon we found ourselves moving deeper into the cemetery, our flashlights flickering, barely piercing the darkness. That's when we first heard it. A low, guttural sound, like the growl of an animal. We froze, our eyes darting around, but all we could see were the tombstones and the shadows stretching endlessly between them. I could feel my pulse quicken, every sense on high alert. Tom laughed nervously, saying it was probably just a coyote. But I knew that sound, and that wasn't it. It was something darker, more threatening. We tried to laugh it off, but the tension was thick, wrapping around us like a cold, damp shroud. The growling sound came again, closer this time, and with it came a rancid smell, thick and cloying, filling the air. It smelled like rot, like something that had been buried too long. Let's get out of here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. None of us argued, but as we turned to leave, the growling erupted into a roar. A sound so deep and powerful that I felt it vibrating in my bones. I whipped around, my flashlight shaking as I pointed it into the darkness. And that's when I saw them, figures tall and twisted, standing between the graves. Their skin was pale, stretched tight over bones, and their eyes gleamed in the flashlight beam, wide and unblinking, filled with a hunger that was far from human. Their mouths hung open, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that glistened in the moonlight, dripping with something dark and viscous. And they were all staring at us. For a moment, we were too stunned to move, too terrified to breathe. With unnatural speed, they rushed toward us, limbs contorting as they tore across the graves, emitting those awful, blood-curdling roars. We screamed, scattering, the panic hitting us like a wave. I bolted, barely able to see where I was going, dodging tombstones and ducking under low-hanging branches. The sounds of my friends' screams echoed behind me, each one cut off in horrible, gurgling gasps that chilled me to the core. I glanced over my shoulder and saw one of the creatures lunging toward Tom, its mouth stretched impossibly wide, its teeth sinking into his shoulder. I watched in horror as it dragged him to the ground, his flashlight spinning away, the beam illuminating flashes of pale skin and gnashing teeth as the creature tore into him. I could feel them behind me, close enough that I could hear their ragged breathing, feel the chill of their presence. I ducked behind an old mausoleum, pressing myself against the cold stone, my heart hammering in my chest. I could still hear the sounds of my friends, cries of terror, wet, crunching sounds that I couldn't fully process, each one more horrifying than the last. And then, slowly, one by one, the sounds stopped, leaving only the growls and snarls of the creatures as they prowled the cemetery, searching. I held my breath, pressing myself further into the shadows, praying that they wouldn't find me. But I could feel them drawing closer, smell the stench of decay as they neared, their low growls filling the air with a chilling anticipation. One of them paused near the mausoleum, sniffing the air, its dark eyes scanning the shadows. I felt a shiver run down my spine as it turned its head, its gaze locking onto mine. There was no humanity in those eyes, no mercy, only an endless, ravenous hunger. I felt like I was drowning in that gaze, my mind unraveling under its intensity. And then it opened its mouth, letting out a low, guttural hiss, its teeth glinting in the faint light as it drew closer. Just as it reached out, there was a faint sound, a rustling from the trees nearby. The creature turned its head, momentarily distracted, and I took my chance. I ran, pushing through the dense undergrowth, my lungs burning, my vision blurring with panic. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away, as far as possible from the cemetery, from the horrors that lurked within it. Somehow, in the panic, I realized Sarah was beside me, her breath ragged, eyes wide with terror. We ran together, fueled by pure, unrestrained fear, tearing through the trees and underbrush without a single thought except escape. Neither of us looked back. Neither of us dared to. Finally, when we reached the edge of town, just beyond the cemetery's wrought iron gates, we stopped, bending over to catch our breath. My legs felt like they'd been carved from stone, and my throat burned with every breath. Sarah was crying, her face pale and streaked with dirt, her shoulders shaking as she clung to me. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on us like a lead blanket. "We shouldn't have come here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Her face was a mix of horror and guilt, and the weight of her words cut through the cold October air. "We never should have. Why did we think this was a good idea?" I swallowed hard, the taste of fear still sharp in my mouth. "I don't know," I said, my voice hoarse. We thought it was just stories, just stupid legends." My mind flashed back to our friends, the looks on their faces, the screams that had ripped through the cemetery. Sarah pulled away, her eyes red and glassy as she stared at me. What are we going to tell their parents?" Her voice cracked as she said it, the question hanging in the air between us. How do we tell them that we just left them behind? That we couldn't save them? I shook my head, the words feeling hollow and empty. I don't know. How could they ever understand? No one would believe us. They'd just think we're lying or that we went crazy. The thought made my chest tighten with an overwhelming dread, a suffocating guilt that felt as if it would swallow me whole. We sat there in silence, the reality of what had happened sinking in. Our friends, our closest friends, were gone, lost to something we couldn't even begin to explain. There would be questions, endless questions that we'd never be able to answer. How could we describe the things we'd seen? How could we explain the nightmare that had ripped our lives apart in a matter of minutes? Sarah looked up at me, her eyes full of a quiet, desperate plea. What if we just say we don't know what happened? That we got lost in the woods and She trailed off, her voice choked with the weight of her own words. And in that moment, I knew she was right. Telling the truth would only bring more questions, more disbelief. People would never understand what we'd seen, what we'd experienced. And the creatures, they were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I didn't want anyone else going back, thinking it was just a story, risking their lives to discover the truth we'd barely escaped. We'll tell them that we looked for them, but we couldn't find them. Sarah nodded, her face crumpling with grief. She looked away, and we sat there in silence, haunted by the screams we'd left behind, by the friends we'd never see again, and by the creatures still lurking in that cursed cemetery. It was a chilly Halloween night when my grandmother called, asking if I could help clear out her attic. She was finally moving to a smaller place, and the old house, which had been in our family for generations, needed to be emptied. I wasn't thrilled about spending Halloween sorting through dusty boxes, but she seemed so eager for the help, and I couldn't say no. As I started going through the boxes, I found myself drawn to one in particular, tucked into a dark corner. It was smaller than the others, its surface scratched and worn, as if it had been opened and closed 1,000 times. Inside, I found something I hadn't expected, a doll. It was beautiful in a way, but unsettling too. Its face was porcelain, pale as bone, with painted cheeks that were too pink, too alive looking. Its glass eyes stared up at me, wide and unblinking, and its mouth was painted into a tiny, unsettling smile. Its dress was old-fashioned, lace trimming the edges of the fabric, yellowed with age. For some reason, I felt a chill creep over me as I looked at it, my mind racing back to memories of stories about cursed dolls, objects that held pieces of people within them. I called down to my grandmother, asking her about the doll, and her voice floated back, more tense than I'd ever heard it. "Oh, I didn't know that thing was still up there," she said, her voice edged with something close to fear. "It was your great-aunt's. She said strange things about it before she passed. She didn't say anything more, but I could feel a cold unease settling over me. I wanted to put the doll back in the box, to forget I'd ever seen it, but as I tried to close the lid, I swear I saw its eyes flicker, just for a split second, as if it was watching me. I blinked, my heart pounding, but the doll's gaze was as empty and lifeless as ever. I told myself it was just my imagination, just a trick of the light, and packed the doll back up. I took the box down and put it in my car, deciding I'd bring it back home with me. I told myself I'd just take it to a donation center the next day, but in truth, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to keep an eye on it, as irrational as that sounded. The whole drive home, I could feel the weight of it in the back seat, as if it were watching me, waiting. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought I heard something, a faint sound, like a whisper, barely audible over the quiet hum of the house. It was soft, rhythmic, and it sounded eerily like the voice of a child. And then, from the darkness, I heard it. A small, light patter, like tiny footsteps moving across the floor. I lay frozen, my heart pounding, and watched as a shadow slowly appeared at the edge of my doorway. It was small, barely 3 feet high, but it was there, standing perfectly still just inside my room. I wanted to turn on the light, to bolt out of bed, but I couldn't move. I watched, helpless, as the figure took a single step forward, and then another, until it was standing right beside my bed. In the faint light filtering in through the window, I could see it. The doll standing upright, its head tilted slightly, its eyes fixed on mine. It should have been impossible. Dolls don't move. They don't come to life. But as I looked into its eyes, I saw something that chilled me to the core. Those empty, glass eyes were no longer hollow. They were filled with a dark, terrible intelligence. a malice that seemed to pulse and breathe with a life of its own. The doll's mouth, painted into that unsettling smile, began to move, stretching wider and wider, twisting into an expression that could only be described as hunger. And then, in a voice that sounded far too real, far too alive, it whispered, "Why did you bring me here?" The words sank into me, filling my chest with a dread so thick I could barely breathe. I couldn't look away from its face, from those eyes that held a darkness so deep, so endless, that I felt as if it would swallow me whole. It reached out a tiny hand, its porcelain fingers cold as ice as they touched my arm, and I felt a jolt of fear so powerful that it brought tears to my eyes. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. The doll tilted its head, and its smile stretched even wider. "I want to be your friend," it whispered, its voice sickly sweet, dripping with malice. "Forever." A chill ran down my spine, and I tried to pull my arm away, but the doll's grip was surprisingly strong. Its tiny fingers dug into my skin, holding me in place. The room seemed to grow darker, the air thick with a suffocating weight that pressed down on me, filling my mind with images I couldn't escape. The doll's voice grew louder, echoing in my mind, filling every corner of the room. "You brought me here," it hissed. "Now you're mine." With a burst of panic-fueled strength, I managed to rip my arm free, bolting out of bed and scrambling to the light switch. The room flooded with light, and I looked around, my chest heaving, my skin clammy with sweat. The doll was lying on the floor, its glassy eyes staring blankly up at the ceiling, its body limp and lifeless. But I knew better. I knew it was waiting. I took the doll back to the attic the very next day, hiding it in the darkest corner I could find, and left my grandmother's house, promising myself I'd never go back. But at night, I still hear it sometimes. The faint sound of footsteps, the soft, eerie whisper, calling my name.